Last Pint Productions presents the New Way podcast. The New Way contains adult content and is recorded in advance. The following episode was originally recorded on April 4th, 2021. Listener discretion is advised.
So you were in Vietnam, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah?
Were you in the shit?
Yeah, I was in the shit.
Last night, Darth Vader came down from planet Vulcan and told me that if I didn't take Lorraine out, that he'd melt my brain.
Here's how you get him. He pulls a knife, you pull a gun. He sends one of yours to the hospital, you send one of his to the morgue.
We came, we saw, we kicked its ass.
Everybody wants to be naked and famous. Everybody wants to be just like me, I'm naked.
Will you help teach me about this? What is it? A new way?
Hello, and welcome to the New Way podcast, where we break down pop culture so you don't have to. I'm your host, Matt Shank, joined by my co-host, Mr. Benjamin Scott Wilson.
Hey.
Fresh back from the South Carolina, as I understand it, for a little Easter weekend vacay, huh?
Happy Easter, Matt.
Happy Easter to you as well. It's rare that we are recording on the Sabbath like this.
Yeah, he is risen. And by he, I mean Matt.
Just for this podcast, and I'm going right back to bed. Or were you talking about that he has risen? That could happen as well.
Yes. They have risen.
All of them. They all float down there. Yes, this is the New Way, brought to you by Last Pint Productions, and we've got a jam-packed episode, of course, for you, as we always do. But I would be remiss if we did not discuss one of our recent episodes. And as we do record these a little bit out of order, I will make sure you will have already heard this episode, so we're not spoiling anything. But
you just mentioned a recent episode. Drink.
Yeah, exactly. We recently met a deviously unassuming gentleman and super fan of the show by the name of Patrick Barrett. And Patrick created for us a intense is the best way I could describe it. An intense drinking game built around our humble little podcast here. And I can safely say it knocked most of us on our asses. Won't say everyone, but it did some damage.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
It was comprehensive. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
It was well thought out. It wasn't one of those, you have 10 things that you have to tick off over the course of the podcast. It was a running list of over 50 things. And
yes,
that was impressive.
And we did have some feedback on it that it was a little hard to follow for those that were not actually watching what was going on, which we have good news. We do have a video version of this that I will be producing. I'm not sure when. That'll be a little Easter egg for you guys sometime over the next couple of months. But we will produce the video version, and we will also make a graphic for you, a visual, so that if you would like to play the drinking game. Now, I will follow Mr. Santa Croce's advice as well on this. I hazard most of you out there to just don't take the game super seriously. And if you feel like you're maybe pushing it a little bit too hard, I don't think we have any college age listeners out there. So we're of a certain age where you got to listen to your body a little bit, and your body's going to tell you at some point, don't keep playing this game at this level.
I think that the pro move is to plan in advance. And if you are going to play the New Way drinking game, maybe do it on one of our shorter episodes, one of the shorter runtime lengths, and do it with a beer that you can safely consume 5 to 7 of without being overly intoxicated. I mean, I only
had 6 beers over the evening. It was over a 4-hour thing, but these were 8% plus beers. One of them was a 10% plus ABV. I would recommend against that. Go with something a little more sessionable. Do not try hard liquor. You will die. There's no way around it. You will not be.
This is exclusively a beer drinking game.
Yeah. But it was fun. We had a great time. And of course, thank you to Patrick for coming up with that. The other thing I want to talk about is a movie that Ben recommended to me a while ago that I finally got around to. And I say, Ben, you did a great job at describing this film, as you usually do, of a mashup of kind of 2 other movies. But the movie is Barb and Star Go to Vista Del Mar. And it's one of the funniest movies I've seen in the last decade or so. It is
it's
amazing. And it's very idiosyncratic. I felt a lot of, Ben had called it Austin Powers meets Wet Hot. I felt a lot of Kids in the Hall in it, a little bit of Three Amigos.
Well, I feel like there's a lot of kids in the Hall and Wet Hot are kind of, I mean, David Wayne and those guys were very sort of on the same wavelength.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I totally get the Kids in the Hall thing.
Yeah, and also there was a lot of, spoiler alert, music in it, and the music numbers also felt very kind of Three Amigos to me. It's just it is a bizarre movie, and it's one of those that I'm very curious because it seems like it's made for streaming, and I think a lot of people would probably say that, but I kind of felt watching it that this could have been one of those sleeper comedies that hits really hard, like in Austin Powers or Bridesmaids, or kind of just this movie that's so bizarre, but if enough people see it, and especially seeing it on the big screen, I think it builds that cult status with it.
Well, I think we've seen movies do that, and the thing is obviously, having COVID around, it's, pushed pretty much everything to streaming to some degree. As a matter of fact, what I was going to say is I think after we're done with this podcast, I'm going to at least start, maybe not finish, but I'm going to start Godzilla versus Kong just because I'm still kind of excited to see that. Because I'm a fan of Adam Wingard, the director. A friend of Nick Santacroce and I was one of the writers on the movie. So yeah, it should be an interesting viewing experience there. But that's a movie that you never would have seen go to streaming.
Sure.
However, these kind of small, independent, very kitschy and off-kilter comedies, things that came out in years past, say like your Hot Rods or your MacGrubers, were probably built for better audiences on those types of platforms. But they didn't really exist at the time of those releases, so they went obviously to a full theatrical release. But they only found their legs once they got on video.
Yeah.
Once they got out there, and that's when you develop, or your Tenacious D Pick of Destinies. It's like the types of things that are just so ridiculously weird and silly and sort of, you think that they're built for this very specific audience. I think that streaming is where those things are going to live now. But I would liken it to some of those aforementioned movies like Hot Rod or and again, like Wet Hot American Summer was a film that, only picked up steam maybe 5, 7, 10 years after it's.
I don't know what it was about it specifically, but I don't know. I had this weird feeling watching it that I'm like, somehow I think this is one of those ones that would have broken through. Like, I think it would have been culty, but I think it would have been kind of one of those lexicon things of, people dressing up like those characters and stuff. There's something that felt very encompassing and innocent, even though it wasn't really very innocent at times. It's a really interesting fucking movie.
Well, and that's the thing is, like, I feel like Austin Powers kind of existed in its own sort of universe because it was silly and it had some super ridiculous comedy and off-kilter comedy. But ultimately, when it came down to it, was a Bond spoof.
Yeah.
And I think that gave people a through line to kind of follow. Whereas I don't think that I don't think that it has any sort of template that's following. It's just bizarre. Yeah. And I think that's a little. I think it's almost a little intimidating for viewers sometimes. I mean, that it's maybe not. Maybe they don't realize it is, but I think I remember that was the thing that got me with Wet Hot the first time, is I was just like, what the fuck is happening with this movie? And I had to watch it a second time to really absorb the humor in it. And then by the third time, I was like, this is the funniest fucking movie I ever made. The first time I watched Wet Hot with Nick Santacroce, I was like, I laughed out loud maybe 3 times in the entire movie. I was smiling, I was enjoying it, but I was just like, yeah, this is just too out there. And it's along the lines of a lot of those movies that you just start repeating lines of over and over and over again. And you understand there's an appeal there, but I don't think that you find it funny until it's repeated. I mean, a lot of people feel that same way about Anchorman. A lot of people hated Anchorman when it first came out, and they watched it a few times and they fucking loved it.
And Anchorman's not a bad comparison. There's something about the Barb and Star that's a little like, so Wet Hot is very edgy's not the right word, but it's a harder pill to swallow. Just like you said, the first time you're watching it, you're not sure. Like, the jokes are not obviously broad jokes, versus Barb and Star is uber broad. It
Right.
is hitting you over the head with these ridiculous things, and then occasionally zigging when you're thinking it's going to zag. And that always seems to me like kind of that. There was something universal in the appeal about it to me watching that. I was just like, if I was a studio exec, I would have put some heat behind that, because I really do. I think it's one of those weird movies that, like, for some reason people collectively just are like, oh yeah, like your mom might find it funny, and you might find it funny, and younger audiences might find it funny.
Right. You know, I still think that that's true, but I still think it's going to live by that we need to watch multiple times type of rule.
Oh yeah.
I mean, and that's a credit to the movie. I think that's a credit to the creators and them being really, you know, it's not one of those comedies that you're going to watch, because ultimately, like, I think about a movie like Bridesmaids. Yes, Bridesmaids is a entertaining movie. Do I have any interest in watching Bridesmaids again? Absolutely fucking not. I would watch that film. I would watch Barb and Star multiple times, because the comedy is layered. There's it's obviously like it is very obtuse at times, and that's what makes it funnier.
It's interesting. It's interesting. I like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's honestly all I really had to get into before we kind of get into our topic. And it's interesting. I want to talk about our choosing of this topic and me sort of making a little bit of a mistake. But because we're going to make a hard left here.
Wait. Hold on. Can I guess what your mistake is going to be?
Did I name the wrong? Yeah, go ahead.
Cinematographer.
Yes.
Okay. So here's the thing: is I occasionally, like, what we used to do, and we've kind of changed the format a little bit. Is we used to do shorter form podcasts where we're talking about a specific actor, a specific director, and we had talked about like this idea of doing the same thing and doing lensed by and talking about a single cinematographer. And I had thought a really interesting thing to do, just because of kind of the range of projects he's worked on, is to do not a short form, but basically a podcast just on Roger Deakins. And so then Matt countered with, well, how about we do him and Janusz Kamiński? And I was just like, ooh, that's a really good idea. They're really different, very, very different. And I realized beforehand, I was like, I don't think that Matt meant Janusz Kamiński.
Who do you think I meant? Do you think you know?
I believe I do. I believe he's worked with Alfonso Cuarón a whole lot.
No? I think so I may have also confused that one with the person I actually meant to say also. And not Del Bonell. I meant to say Conrad Hall.
Okay, well, so Conrad Hall is the late great Conrad Hall, passed away in 2002. That is not who I thought.
And why my head was doing that was because we recently did a podcast on Sam Mendes, and I was thinking about his evolution from working with Conrad Hall on American Beauty and then working with Roger Deakins later on. So that was what was going on in my head. Then I also realized I was conflating Deakins and Del Bonell, who I think is who you thought I was going to be talking about.
Bruno Del Bonell is one of my favorite lensers. I assumed that you were talking about his name is escaping me right now, which is awful because he's one of the greatest living cinematographers right now. Hold on one second, and I'm pulling it up, and I'm thinking of, oh God, why is this terrible? Hold on, you know, oh man,
we've gone completely off the rails, folks.
Yes, we've gone completely off the rails. But anyways, I did think it was funny because I assumed
you're thinking of Lubezki. That's who you thought I was thinking of. Listen, these names are all somewhat Polish and confusing, and I'm not great at them despite knowing the differences in their works. But yes, I conflated several things, and it is it is funny and interesting to talk about Kamiński versus Deakins, but I think it's going to be very heavy on one of them and lighter on the other, in my opinion.
I disagree, actually, because I think that they have equally heralded careers.
Okay.
And I think that's well shown through. I mean, first off, for those that don't know, Roger Deakins did not win a Best Cinematography Award until 2 years ago with 1917. That was Deakins' first Academy Award win.
He won before for Blade Runner. His first was Blade Runner. His second was for 1917.
For the new Blade Runner.
He was nominated 13 times without winning, which was tied the record, and then he
Blade
won
Runner,
14 and 15 back to back.
And then immediately won after that. Interesting. Okay. So that makes sense, though. Well, meanwhile, I mean, Janusz Kamiński won for Saving Private Ryan back in 1998.
And he won before that, too.
And he won before that as well.
For Schindler's
List, which is a really interesting one, which I'm sure that we'll get to. But very different approaches to cinematography. And for those who listen, obviously, we're going to geek out on a couple of things here because cinematography is, acutely, it's the design. And I think it's really interesting sometimes just to kind of clarify. A lot of people will see certain films and they'll say, oh, this looks like a Tim Burton movie, or this looks like whatever. And what I think they refer to is a lot of times what you consider mise en scène, which is the way a film looks, which it involves the production design and it involves sometimes the character interactions. But oftentimes it's a director working with a cinematographer to create an aesthetic that kind of fits their narrative view. What I think that the biggest thing is for really successful cinematographers are cinematographers that have their own unique style and filming style, but are able to sort of adapt that based off of the property and based off of the director and or the property that they're working on, which I think both Deakins and Kamiński are really good at doing. They're very different cinematographers because the way that they film is completely different. And Kamiński is also Janusz Kamiński is really well known for working with Spielberg because that's basically been the last 25 years of his career,
with the exception of there are probably like eight major movies he's done that are not, but he has done 19 movies with Spielberg. He's already lensing a 20th right now that Spielberg is working on currently. Which is kind of amazing. And then you have putting that up against Deakins is very interesting because Deakins has a larger body of work, but Deakins also falls into patterns. But his biggest is
Deakins
Coen's.
is older. I mean, Deakins is over 10 years older than Janusz Kamiński.
So let's kind of step back just for a second before we really get into their individual work and kind of talk about these two cinematographers. And I will definitely have questions for Ben because I do like to pick Ben's brain on these cinematography podcasts because I have maybe a better understanding than the general public, but still a lot of stuff is very confusing to me. But you look at these two guys, and as we've said, Kamiński had once he started with Spielberg, and his first movie with Spielberg was Schindler's List, which he won his first Oscar for.
And the reason why I found that kind of an irony, I didn't realize he won for that. I thought his first win was with Saving Private Ryan for some reason. Is because Schindler's List, as well designed of a movie they had no storyboarding.
Yeah.
There was no shot design when they were making that movie. It was shot documentary style. So it was literally Janusz Kamiński running around with a camera on his shoulder.
Well, and
filming a Super 35. And so there's lots of it's not as it went against everything that Spielberg had done and really has done with Kamiński since that time, where everything is very acutely planned because he wanted to try and make something as raw as he possibly could.
And it's very interesting because you look at Kamiński's pre-Schindler's List set of films, and there are some things that could lead you to believe he might go on to this thing, but there are other things where he started off as a B movie lenser working with Corman. He lensed the cinematic masterpiece Cool as Ice, the Vanilla Ice vehicle. He did that movie. So Cool as Ice was 91. Schindler's List was 93.
But before you say anything, though, Kamiński has the greatest 1-2 punch of all time, of going from two movies that are complete opposites to one another. He went from Schindler's List to Little Giants.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up too. Yeah,
which I think is the most awesome thing. Well, here's the thing is, if you notice his films, even the B movie or kind of the normal films, quote unquote, that he directed, they still look good. They're all. It's not like he was doing it just for the paycheck. He definitely had an acute idea behind what he was trying to convey with his imagery. But obviously, like I said, you're still working within the confines of the story that you're filming and the director that you're working with, and trying to basically serve their vision.
Yeah.
Ultimately. So it doesn't matter that, I think that obviously when he's working with Spielberg and he has these kind of, they're able to do these kind of grandiose, things that may take a lot of setup and framing. Doing Little Giants, hey, there's some really cool stuff that they do with some fisheye, anamorphic, wide angle stuff in Little Giants that I still remember.
Well, and what's really interesting is watching his once he does Schindler's List and Little Giants, then he starts to kind of, he's mostly working for Spielberg, but he's every so often getting another big name director grabbing him. Kind of you can see the idea of being like, oh, this guy just like shot like Spielberg's last 2 movies or whatever. Let's grab him for like before he probably is becoming more of that household name. And then you kind of put that conversely with Deakins, who starts off a little bit differently. And I read a bunch of stuff about him, and I have a couple of questions about some things I read, Ben. But the one thing before we do that I think is really interesting is that Kamiński has a very overused is the wrong word, but Spielberg's movies from basically Saving Private Ryan on have a very specific this washed out quality oftentimes to the film. What's funny about that is the person who apparently popularized that in Western cinema was Roger Deakins. He actually brought the concept of bleaching
with the Coens, with bleach bypass.
Well, no, bleach. No, it was one of his really early ones. And I remember watching this movie in high school. Was 1984, and he did the bleach bypass in 1984 with John Hurt. It's actually an adaptation of the book 1984 that was released in 1984. But I remember seeing that in high school before Saving Private Ryan. I'm like, this movie is so bleak, because that was the idea, is that we're in this dystopian future and everything has been blown out. And he used that technique, which I thought was kind of funny, that I accidentally put these 2 cinematographers against one another. And one of them made a lot of his career based around a similar aesthetic to that.
I would argue, I don't think that Kamiński, in some cases, yes, I think that he uses it to a very strong degree. I would actually, we'll get into some of the technical aspects of it a little bit later, but I would say Janusz Kamiński actually, with a lot of his Spielberg stuff, and sometimes very purposefully oversaturates what he is doing. Whereas somebody like just to create a differentiation between characters, or between if you're looking at the aspect ratio between characters or something along those lines, and you're looking at these hard rack focuses between 2 characters, I think he actually does a lot to almost overpopulate the color in the scene, whereas Deakins does something to populate the entire scene. If you look at some of the more famous Deakins shots, there's not a whole lot of contrast in the scenes. It's more about the way things are placed within the frame, and then the entire frame has one certain feel. It's not about creating different feels within one frame, which I think Kamiński does a really good job of, and is part of his aesthetic. This is not a who's better than who. Yeah, it's more about like, and I'm sure that Kamiński would probably put Deakins up there as an inspiration.
Oh yeah, and I think that's what's. I think it's interesting, especially if you look at there was kind of a run of them with Spielberg, with like Minority Report. And I mean, Spielberg shoots so much that it is hard to remember there are these movies in between, but like Minority Report and War of the Worlds and Munich.
But then you have like Catch Me If You Can, which is different. Is completely oversaturated. War Horse, completely oversaturated, very full of color. And so, yeah, it's definitely, he's got some flexibility there.
So I have a question for you on this fact I read on Deakins. So Deakins never shoots with anamorphic lenses.
Right.
He says when he shoots for 235-1, he shoots with either Super 35 stock or he crops it in post. And he prefers working with spherical lenses for the look, and feels anamorphic are slower with processing light and give unwanted blemishes like lens flares. So can you explain that a little bit for
Okay, so actually this is it's a great comparison point, because here's, I'll actually start. So that's an interesting point about Deakins. I'll start with Kamiński. If you watch a lot, especially the Spielberg Kamiński films, and another one which I'm going to get to last probably on this podcast because I think it's his masterpiece from a filming standpoint. Kamiński, we're talking about grit, grime, light. The use of light, and it doesn't matter if that's hitting the lens in 3 different ways, because if you watch any Spielberg film, you'll notice he loves lens flares, intentional or otherwise. He loves very stark light through windows. He loves foggy rooms where you're seeing beams going in certain directions. And this is fits perfectly into Kamiński's sort of his aesthetic that he brings to films that he works on. It's very, very dirty. If dirt gets on the lens, cool. You know, it's kind of this, you know, it's very more visceral type of feel. And Kamiński will use anamorphic lenses. Now, here's the thing about anamorphic lenses is that when you're shooting anamorphic, essentially you're looking at an aspect ratio of 2:3:5 to 1, which is that kind of ultra wide screen that you used to see cropped, you know, where you used to ask, why is there black on the top?
Letterboxing.
Yeah. Why was there letterboxing on my VHS? And now, you know, TVs are shaped to the 16:9, so you don't notice the letterboxing as much, but still there is letterboxing when something is shot anamorphic. Well, when you film an anamorphic, with anamorphic 35 millimeter, anamorphic 70 millimeter lens or film stock, or you're replicating that with a digital camera, which you can do. You can replicate an anamorphic frame. You're filming with lenses that are essentially going to populate that frame that you're shooting for with the image that you want. So that means that they're ocular, but they're flatter. And that causes, because of the size of the image, some distortion on the edge of the image. It's a cool look. And if you watch ever any old like David Lean movies, or if you watch, I mean, really going back pretty far, even into the 30s and 40s, films that were shot anamorphic, you'll see some what we call frame distortion on the edge of frame, where basically the image is stretched just a little bit. It's used to great effect nowadays. A lot of directors use it to, you know, Christopher Nolan, people along those lines will use it to kind of, you know, especially if you're working with scale or scope. But yeah, it distorts the image on the edge of frame. It can create some very pretty pictures. It also offers you a much wider depth of field. So, you know, you can have people who are 16 feet away from one another, typically with the less ocular lenses, the anamorphic lenses. So they're still in frame and focus. You don't have to rack as much, basically, especially if you're shooting with a wider anamorphic frame. But Deakins likes spherical lenses that are non-anamorphic because he likes zero distortion. He likes a shallower depth of field. He likes zero distortion, and he wants to work with essentially less light because anamorphic lenses require a lot of light to basically process the image to get it through to the film. This isn't as much of an issue now with digital, but that's kind of the thing about it. Again, it's 2 completely separate approaches, and neither is right or wrong. I think that what that says, though, is that Deakins, when he frames something in his mind, he's framing it as photorealistic, whereas someone who shoots with anamorphic is aware that it's going to warp. It may do something different than the actual image that you would see, and you have to be cool with that. Mm-hmm. Also understanding that the light is going to play a lot differently and probably less realistically with anamorphic lenses, which requires more light, which also requires more distortion, like lens flares and that type of thing.
And that's a very Spielbergian thing, and J.J. Abrams takes that to a uber level. And it's really interesting because I was reading up on Deakins about this stuff. And this idea, now that I kind of understand that better, is interesting because he, shooting on 35 millimeter film, he's talked about having really bad luck with it. Now that more and more is going to digital, it's getting harder and harder to process the film and be able to trust labs and have the right stock of the film. And he had huge issues working on Hail Caesar with the Coen brothers. and like losing film and losing takes and shots and stuff like that. And apparently it's panicked him a little bit about this idea of what is the future of 35 millimeter film. And it's something he likes to shoot on, but is now a little gun shy about, because it's an older school method that's not getting the love anymore as guests.
Well, I know that one thing that Arriflex has been doing is they've created a rig for a lot of the filmmakers who still like to shoot on film, where it's basically you're shooting on a Super 35, Arriflex Super 35 or whatever, your whatever actual deck you want to shoot your whether it's normal 35 or Super 35 or even Super 16. But they've built a rig that attaches an Arriflex Alexa Cine onto it. And so basically with the same lens set, so you're essentially catching the same image, just a couple inches apart from one another, but one is immediately backing up on digital and shooting it essentially in like an S-Log or RAW format that allows for color correction, where the other is basically native to what it is that you're doing on the film. And the thing is it's just a backup. It's basically saying, like, if this gets transferred wrong, or if this film gets damaged, you know that you have something digitally to replace it, and you can just match it to the rest of your frame. You can play with the film however you want to, or process it however you want to, or as many times as you want to, but at least you have that digital backup to match, which is, I think, smart.
Yeah, absolutely.
From a filmmaking standpoint, but
I mean, I can't imagine the fear of working with film. It just, and over the years, just in general, of so much can go wrong with shooting on film.
Well, so, I mean, that's, I don't know how much I've talked about in the podcast, but my third project in film school, which is what we call our F3 project, I decided I wanted to shoot a music video. And the reason why I wanted to do a music video is I wanted to see if I could shoot a music video, a 4-minute music video, using 1,600 feet of film, which is like, for example, if Michael Bay shot a music video back in the mid 90s, he would probably use maybe 300,000 feet of film. Yeah. So I was trying to use 1,600, and I was seeing what I could get away with, basically, which meant a lot of like single angle, one takes. I could only do parts of the song on certain takes. It was really interesting. It was a huge challenge. And it was fun. And like, I was interested. It was interested in working around it, of thinking like, I'm going to have 48 minutes of raw video to make a 4-minute music video. Like, how can I creatively edit this?
Which is not a lot, just for those of you out there in general, that's not, like normally your ratio of shooting to what actually shows up is much bigger than that.
I know that 48 minutes, like how much is going to be usable, like there might be 7 minutes where we're like, we don't like the take, or we don't like what's going on screen, or what. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff like that. Working with film is extremely, if you don't know what you're doing, it's extremely volatile, and it definitely makes you. And one of the things I really I don't like about kind of the current age of filmmakers that are kind of coming up is they really do have the ability to just go over and over and over again, which you didn't unless you were Stanley fucking Kubrick in the past, where it's like, yeah, we'll do 117 takes of a certain thing. Nobody's getting away with that. It's just like, you're going to film, like at one point, a financier is going to come.
Unless you're Fincher.
Like, you just spent $60,000 worth of film stock on one take, like on one setup. And that's untenable.
And that's and we've flirted with this on other episodes, but it's a good standalone discussion for another episode, which is the idea of do parameters and limitations breed creativity more so than being able to do whatever you want?
And you know my answer.
And I know your answer on that. But I think there are arguments on both sides, and we're going to see it. I mean, we're seeing it now that we are in a digital age where things are being able to we can shoot for comedies, especially. We can shoot so much extra material. I mean, Anchorman's a famous one. They shot an entire second movie of alternate takes for that film. I mean, it's crazy. But so kind of back on go ahead.
Just as a note, just to piggyback on that before we get back to the main topic. But I think the interesting thing now is what we see is that, like, we oftentimes laud small films with really creative ideas that do it sort of within their own parameters. And I think that what we're going to see nowadays is it's not going to be a limitation on film stock because they're going to be able to do it over and over again. But it is going to be a limitation on budget, on location, on like all of these other parameters. Because that's the thing is we always talk about like, hey, it's amazing that they did this movie and this location with these people who aren't actors. And that we always talk about those types of films. And so I think that is going to continue to be a thing. I just don't see it happening in cinematography anymore because we're only moving forward at this point. We're not moving back to the point where we're like, unless somebody comes out with some stupid dogma shit rule where it's like, hey, I'm going to shoot this entire movie on, 5,000 feet of film. Watch me do it,
Yeah, that's it. It's interesting. I mean, and it is, and there are fewer and fewer filmmakers that are burdening themselves with that, including the big filmmakers of just being like, no,
really right now, I think the only filmmakers that still only work on film are Quentin Tarantino, P.T. Anderson, not even the Coen brothers. So the Coen brothers have shot digitally now. I mean, those are the big ones. Are Tarantino and P.T. Anderson. Yeah. I mean, really, those are the stalwarts of the industry that are actually still making sure that we're shooting on some sort of just, and obviously Chris Nolan is another one, but he shoots in a variety of different formats.
Sure. Yeah, he's just Frankensteining all kinds of different things together from
he's shooting fucking IMAX,
crazy shit,
digital, and
which is kind of interesting. He's the other side of it. It's just like I'm gonna do everything, and fuck you, like I'm gonna stitch it all together, and who cares when it's shifting. That idea of shifting perspectives and aspect ratios and stuff is also really fascinating.
So before we even get a little bit deeper into this, I wanted to say I found a really interesting through line for both, and I think this is true for most really famous cinematographers, of which I think we can say Janusz Kamiński and Roger Deakins are probably two of the more famous living cinematographers. But I think that what they both did is they both created a pretty well-known career early on to the point where they got some recognition. They got on projects that made them big or bigger. They got them more esteemed projects. They both went on to win Academy Awards or were nominated for Academy Awards for their achievements. And then later in their careers did something that I think put them into another echelon of greatest of all time, into that top 10, top 20 greatest cinematographers of all time. I think both of which for Deakins and for Janusz Kamiński they did not win the Oscars for, which I think is interesting. But we'll get to that. So, but I thought that was an interesting point to just make as we kind of talk through their careers.
Yeah, they have, and we've talked about kind of this variation of kind of as who's shooting more or less, and it might even just be that there's a lot of just very high profile on Deakins, even he is older, but also just kind of like he is working constantly. And it's funny, he does have one of those really interesting Cliff's Notes things on his career, which is one of the first and only cinematographers to be nominated twice in 1 year. And of course, this was back when he did not win Oscars, so he did not win the Oscar, but he was nominated for No Country for Old Men and The Assassination of Jesse James, and lost to Robert Elswith for There Will Be Blood, which I don't argue with.
I wouldn't disagree with that, and I'm not even sure that he would disagree with it.
No, I don't. I have. It's one of those. It's got to suck, especially at that point, because that was his 7th and 8th or 6th and 7th nominations, and he's not winning.
Elswith shot the shit out of There Will Be Blood, and that's a beautiful movie. I mean, that's one of the more gorgeous movies of this century, I think you would say. I think it's really interesting that Deakins was pretty well known in British cinema and British television. But I think the movie that got him some international pull was Sid and Nancy, because Sid and Nancy had one of the more iconic shots. It's on the cover of the fucking Blu-ray. It's on the cover of the old VHS. It's on the cover of everything, which is there was a shot that it was shot at around 200 frames per second of Sid and Nancy kissing next to a dumpster. And then as they are kissing, garbage begins to fall from the sky for no real apparent reason. But it's a very artistic, very they had a very clear aim with what they were trying to get across with the shot, the way it was sort of pseudo backlit, but where it was silhouetted, but you could still get some features of both of the characters and really kind of understand what was going on in the scene. I think that kind of catapulted him to doing a lot more international work, because before that he had done nothing but British work basically.
And he also, when I mentioned being really happy that he won his first Oscar for Blade Runner the same year that Gary Oldman won his Oscar for Churchill, and he liked the synergy.
I didn't realize that.
And he goes, I've never worked with Gary Oldman other than on this one of the first movies that put me on the map, which was Sid and Nancy.
Oh, that's funny. I didn't know
so
that.
he was
That's
really
awesome.
happy about that kind of synergy of these things. But yeah,
cool.
I mean, really, 1984, which was not a huge hit by any means. It's a very weird.
It was something that had been adapted, I believe, for short form television. And
yeah, I was wondering if it maybe went to TV, because it was one of those things that was really hard. I mean, I remember it was very difficult to get my hands on that movie when we were doing that book in high school. This is like, 96 or 95.
Was it like a BBC movie?
I'm not sure. All I know is that it was not a big movie. It was not something. I worked at Blockbuster, and I had to actually like special order it when I worked there to get my hands on that movie. So it wasn't like that was put on. Sid and Nancy was pretty big, but I think his first foray with the Coen brothers is his really big first one, which is Barton Fink.
Barton Fink, yeah.
And that kicks off, this career with them of a dozen movies, 12 movies he's done with them. But I love watching the trajectory. Like, he's a great person to look at on IMDb and look at the actual directors behind each of the movies that he works with, because you see which ones he goes back to, but he's worked with the Coens, with Mamet, with John Sayles, with Frank Darabont, with Tim Robbins directing. He worked with Edward Zwick, Norman Jewison, Ron Howard, Scorsese. It's an amazing career.
Talking about Deakins' run in the 90s, I mean, he was working with really well established directors, doing really solid work, but not like kind of show me off work, if that makes sense. Like I wouldn't say Courage Under Fire is a show me off cinematography masterpiece or anything along those lines. Even Shawshank Redemption, which is a wonderfully lensed movie, is not showy.
No.
I would say that typically the actually, funny enough, and you want to talk about the irony, the best shots in that movie feel like Spielberg, which are those kind of wide, like as the opera's playing and it's the wide, the
exact shot I was thinking in my head. Crane
exactly.
shot.
No, but it's a Spielberg shot. It's everyone looking up at the speaker and having that big crane shot come up basically with the wide angle lens. And it's a Spielberg shot. Most of those movies in the 90s, I feel like Deakins, they look great and they feel like they match the movies. They don't look like Deakins though, to me.
No.
Like they don't look like Sid and Nancy. They look like somebody who knows what they're doing, who's doing exactly what the director says to do. Then but here's the thing. The Coen brothers movies look like Coen brother movies. They also look like Roger Deakins movies in a way. So it's kind of a weird sort of mishmash thing there. But then there's a huge departure with one movie that he shot, that the Coen brothers directed, where they abandoned their own aesthetic and created something completely new. And do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't.
Oh, Brother, Where Art Thou is a completely different looking movie than anything the Coens had done before that. Far different, both from a color grading standpoint, from the maturity of the framing of that movie is ridiculous. It really was a huge step up for the Coens from a technical standpoint of like the way that they were creating films. And that's not to denigrate Fargo or any of the movies or Blood Simple, anything that they had made before that as far as the quality of filmmaking. They went to a technical level that was way higher with Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And Roger Deakins was just like, oh yeah, let me play in that fucking sandbox now. And that movie is immaculately lensed. And it's not the masterpiece I think that he gets to later, but I think that was the movie where Deakins became what we know as Deakins today. That was a good 2 decades ago. because now I think that Deakins is against Lubetzky, against some other big ones in the industry, or is known as is probably the premier cinematographer.
He's the guy. I mean,
world.
yeah. And that's a really interesting look at it. And it's especially interesting to talk about the Coen. It's very, just like we can't separate Spielberg from Kamiński. You can't really separate. Well, Deakins does a pretty good job of separating, actually. But what's interesting is that the Coen brothers start off their career with Barry Sonnenfeld as their cinematographer, who eventually just decided he wanted to make his own movies. And you might have seen a few of those movies of Men in Black and The Addams Family, and just an amazing career with a very Tim Burton-y-esque. And then he launched his own Sonnenfeld did a series of unfortunate events. I'm gonna forget the guy's name, but he basically launched kind of another guy did Pushing Daisies and stuff, and they kind of went down this very broad aesthetic. And so you see Deakins kind of following a much more grounded version of that in things like Barton Fink, but especially Hudsucker Proxy feels very broad in the way that's shot. And you get, Fargo is Fargo. I mean, Fargo is mostly your setting, what you're set in that's dictating what's happening.
Really well framed.
Yes.
Very, very, very pretty for what it is. But there's nothing showy about the movie at all.
No. And then you get something like Lebowski, which feels like Sonnenfeld again, where you're just like you're having a lot of fun. You're doing this bowling alley dream sequence and just these Dutch angles and just crazy shit. And it's really interesting to think of that guy going on to the movies that he eventually does. So now I'm curious. Let's keep on Deakins for right now. So you kind of talked about what a turning point movie was for him. So where do we hit his opus, in your opinion?
I think his opus is The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. Because I still remember when that movie came out in 2006, I believe it was, or 2007. So 2007. So at that point, Deakins had become a much bigger name. He was well known, obviously, for doing all of his work, and especially for No Country for Old Men, and everything leading up to that. Prior to,
and I can kind of just to get us there. And this, I don't want this to feel like an IMDb, but I think it helps to kind of watch his progression. We're not going to go into each of these. I went down these with the. So he goes. He works with John Sayles on Passion Fish, The Secret Garden, Hudsucker Proxy. Then we're into like a good stretch: The Shawshank Redemption, Dead Man Walking, Fargo, Courage Under Fire, Kundun, his one Scorsese movie, Lebowski, The Siege, The Hurricane, a movie called Anywhere But Here, which is an interesting, small, weird movie with that's Susan Sarandon and Natalie Portman. That was in the very late 90s. I remember it was on HBO a lot when I was in school. And then they had do an interesting back-to-back with the Coens, which is Oh Brother Where Art Thou and The Man Who Wasn't There, which I was
The Man Who Wasn't There was one of the more amazing.
I thought that's what you were going to say instead of Oh Brother Where Art Thou, and I believe that's the one that Deakins says is his like one of his like I had a voice. This was my voice being
so The Man Who Wasn't There is might be my favorite Coen Brothers film because I love the film and I love the way it's shot. But again, it's more of a sensibility thing. Just because I think it's the best movie, I still think the parameters and the scope of what they had to film around with Oh Brother Where Art Thou took him to that next level. Yeah. And like I said, so now he's at that next level. Now he's waiting for like the magnum opus. Yeah. So I'm more interested in the films that were between then and
so now he gets to A Beautiful Mind with Ron Howard, which might be the most beautifully shot Ron Howard movie. A movie called Levity that I'm not familiar with, Intolerable Cruelty, which I know is a very divisive Coen Brothers movie. Yeah. The House of Sand and Fog, which is a beautifully shot fucking flick. The Lady Killers, which I like. Most people do not like Lady Killers, the Coens, but The Village, not a great movie, but looks great. Then one that we talked about in the podcast recently, Jarhead, and that's his first time working with Sam Mendes, and a beautiful fucking flick, as we've talked about on a previous episode.
It definitely lends itself to the story.
And now he does 3 movies in 2007. Obviously shot at different times between 2005 and 2007. But it's No Country for Old Men, In the Valley of Elah with quote unquote director Paul Haggis, and The Assassination of Jesse James. Those three are all released in the same year. And I agree. I believe one of the first things we talked about was that movie. Because we had met around the Oscars right after that, sometime around then. But that's a really gorgeous fucking movie. The Assassination of Jesse James by the
I mean, it's one of the things, and I think that the way it was described is that movie is like a cinematographer's dream, because they allowed him the freedom to storyboard and basically say, okay, here's the way that the scene works, what works with it visually, and they let him run rampant with his ideas. And so he basically got to make the most artistic movie, the most cinematographically artistic film that he could possibly make from his end. And it's just full of iconic, I mean, the on the train track and the silhouette and these, Brad Pitt in the field, or they're with Robert Ford looking away. I mean, there's so many iconic images in a film that wasn't seen by that many goddamn people, unfortunately.
It's a long movie.
It's a long movie,
some people,
and a lot of people will say it's slow. I think it's fucking amazing. I think it's a great film. But yeah, I think that is definitely what brought him up. I think that's his masterpiece. Here's the thing, though. Deakins keeps topping himself, because it's like, I say it's his masterpiece, but since then he's done so many movies that I absolutely adore. He did Skyfall, which I think is the best shot and easily,
which we talked about, in 1917, which is
an immense achievement. I mean, I don't think that anybody who watches 1917 would be able to say anything otherwise than it's brilliant, and it's absolutely just fucking flawless when it comes to shot design. He in Blade Runner, I mean, like,
yeah.
Talk about taking a creative aesthetic, something that's already there, and having to try and build off of it, and creating something that looks the same but looks just innately new at the same time. He's an absolute master, and like I said, there's no question that he is, I think, like you said, the guy at this point.
And what's really interesting, especially as we can have in a moment here,
fucking Arrival.
Yeah,
I mean, Jesus Christ! Like all Prisoners, all the work that he's done with
and I was gonna kind of just get over into those in a second here, before we kind of hop back a little bit to Kamiński. And I did feel, like I said, I felt we were probably going to do a lot on Deakins, and deservedly so. And a lot of these things we don't even have to go into detail, because we've talked about his movies show up on this podcast constantly. Revolutionary Road with Mendes, we've talked about. Prisoners, any of Villeneuve's movies. Prisoners, we've talked about. Sicario, and then there are but what I think the thing that sets him apart for me, specifically to Kamiński, is that Kamiński does, and this is partly Spielberg as well, Spielberg doesn't do a lot of small much anymore. Even his smaller stories are grand in their execution and their telling, which is kind of his thing. Sometimes to take something like Catch Me If You Can, which is this small story, but make it big and make it cinematic, and that's his thing. But you look at Deakins, who does something like Doubt, which is almost a play on film, which
has some. It's beautiful and has some very deliberate filmmaking decisions. And
I think that's what's interesting in Doubt. He is very much dictating those performance beats and those and giving the director things to work with in the editing to say, how are we shooting each of these characters to sow discord and, pardon the pun, doubt into their motivation and where those characters are going. I think is really fascinating to see how much a cinematographer has a voice in those ideas.
No, 100%. And I think you bring up a really good point with Doubt, because for a film that's shot traditionally, quote unquote, whatever that means, if you're talking about coverage, where you're talking about shoulder, over the shoulder, you're talking about a wide, you're talking about 3 angles, and you're getting the scene and you're moving on to the next scene. The Clint Eastwood mantra of filmmaking, basically print it and move on. There's very, very small changes depending on what's going on with the scene, with where the camera moves.
Yes.
And it jumps the line and intentionally at times goes against filmmaking rules and will jump the line during a scene to change the perspective of which character has the upper hand.
Yeah.
And it does it very subtly. It's a movie that you have to watch multiple times to just say, oh, wait, I see what they did there. Like, to make all of a sudden you feel a balance and power shift. And it's not just a move from a wide or from a medium to a close-up, which is what you would usually do. It's a wide moving to a medium, moving to a close-up, but it's on the other side of the room, shooting the other direction, back at Meryl Streep. And that all of a sudden gives her this look of power, like she's looking down on. It's a very, very interesting thing. And it was very deliberate. It feels like a play where the shots are telegraphing what it is that they're going to say next, which is really interesting.
And you look at how prolific he is in this. So 2007, he does these 3 large movies and gets 2 Oscar nods. 2008, he does Doubt, The Reader, and Revolutionary Road. All also big Oscar bait movies. He only gets a nod for The Reader. That's his 8th Oscar nomination. He doesn't get a nod for...
I didn't see The Reader.
Doubt, or I've not seen the Hugh Jackman. Still the greatest moment on Oscars jokes ever. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of amazing to look at that. And then he goes back to the Coens with A Serious Man. A movie called The Company Man, which I remember seeing previews for and wanting to see. I never watched it.
I don't think I ever saw that.
And then one of my favorite flicks that he's lensed for the Coen brothers, just from a aesthetic standpoint, is True Grit, which I think does some, especially there's a scene where they wind up at a cabin at night. And there's a lot of, again, I like watching these guys that are very clearly in tune with what is happening in a scene and what feeling you're giving to the audience based on how things are shot in the scene.
It's clear that he works well with the Coens, and the Coens kind of trust him, or innately trust him from an early on, really before he was a big thing in Hollywood. They trusted him with all of their imagery, which that says something.
Yeah.
I think,
Well, and it's funny.
And
this
the same can be said about
this is the last
Spielberg
one.
and
I think we can other stuff we've covered with him, but the last one I would talk about him that is kind of interesting is he is listed as the cinematographer on an animated film, and that animated film is Rango, which is Gore Verbinski's movie. Which, if you've ever watched the behind the scenes of Rango, was shot a lot of live action and thought of like a live action movie.
So basically what they did is they shot it on just in a room. We're not talking about motion capture. We're not talking about anything like that. They shot it in a white room with all of the actors walking around like it was a play and reciting their lines and saying it the way that they would say it. And it was shot, with multiple cameras, kind of almost like a sitcom, whatever. And then they utilize those performances and they use that in the dictation of creating the actual animated characters. Very, very smart.
And a lot of the set pieces and shot design were aping other classic, like not
Westerns,
super well known. Yeah, but a lot of Westerns and different movies that were being used as inspiration. But it's a really interesting, it's exactly the kind of movie that I read something or hear about later on and be like, oh, Deakins worked on that. Yeah, I completely see that.
Well, and so that was the other thing we found out after the fact. I saw this movie, but a completely different situation where they did everything first, where they had all the voice acting done basically, and they had a lot of the initial rendering done. But it's How to Train Your Dragon. They brought in Roger Deakins to say,
"Oh no, shit! I didn't know that."
So on he is a consultant on the film, not the cinematographer. But they said, what would be the most effective way to show, But I think the best parts are for example, when he first meets Toothless, and he frees him, and there's that shot where he pins him against the rock, and it's half of his head in frame. It's you're getting a perspective. That's all. It was all Deakins basically saying, no, get his this is all you see is an eye and half of a head, and basically saying this is what he should see, and make it intense, make that an intense character moment. So yeah, a lot of those types of stuff, not the crazy aerial battles or anything like that, but he was brought as a consultant for all those character moments about like, where should the camera be?
That's amazing. God, I had no idea. And I'm a big fan of that movie, which makes sense that he would have his.
Yeah, I don't know if he worked on the sequels.
It
was the first one. He was like, he was brought in as a consultant, and they paid him to basically say, where should the camera be, and show like what should the perspective be for this scene. And it's super smart, and it's brilliant. So, anyways, yes, obviously we're all big Deakins fans, and it's hard not to be. But
and it's not to shortchange, not that you can really shortchange him, to Kamiński at all in this, and obviously looking at Kamiński's.
I'm about to give you a hot take.
Uh-oh.
I'm about to give you a really, really hot take.
Oh boy,
my favorite lensed film of Kamiński I like better than any Deakins film.
And you're talking about Funny People, the 2009 Judd Apatow.
Oh my God, how did you know?
Kamiński did lens that movie, just so you all know. I'm not joking about that.
It was one of the few. It's one of the few he has done that's not been Spielberg over the past 20 odd years. So, anyways, I would say Kamiński had that same sort of trajectory that the Deakins did. I for some reason I really didn't think he won for Schindler's List, which I think is, like I said again, is really interesting because of the aesthetic of that movie. I understand why it won, because the movie was so good, and it was a really interesting approach to it. I still think that's more Spielberg than it was Kamiński. But then Saving Private Ryan, you're talking about launching somebody into another echelon.
Yeah,
that is one of the more viscerally shot films I've ever seen. And again, it's about getting dirt on the lens. It's about like not caring.
And shooting in that high frame rate so that things are happening fast and real.
So that's what we call a skinny shutter. So basically
let's not shame the shutters for their size, Ben. That's just rude. It's just dismissive.
Okay, so probably what that was shot at was like a 45 shutter. So the idea is that if you're shooting 24 frames a second, the shutter is opening and closing 24 times, same as the images that are being taken on the film. Well, what happens if you speed up or slow down that shutter opening and closing? It means your film is exposing at different times with a different look. So that means you're skipping frames, or there are multiple exposures within the context of one frame. That's essentially what shutter speed dictates, or if you change the shutter speed to be different than what it is at the film speed that you're shooting. So that look of that everyone's emulated now, which had been done before, but in Saving Private Ryan was super highly popularized.
Yes.
Which is where it feels very like you just see grit and dirt and everything along those lines. The shutter speed is moving faster than the film stock. So essentially what's happening is that the shutter is opening twice as fast. So it's giving an almost strobe-like effect to the viewer without them realizing it, that their images are double exposed. So what that makes it look like is, as opposed to images flashing by 24 frames a second, which what our eyes perceive as normal, we're seeing two images go by. So it's 48 frames per second, but you're seeing two images per second. So it feels jumpy.
And it doesn't feel like there's a motion blur like film, which especially at that point you're very used to and conditioned versus watching something that's on tape. When you watch a sitcom back in the 90s versus watching a film, or a soap opera especially was known for having kind of that being shot on the frame rate is basically in real time.
But you could do the same thing by shooting 48 frames per second and then condensing that down to 24. Because you get less motion blur and it would feel more like a soap opera. But in this case, you were basically seeing a double image that was jumping into the next image, jumping into the next image that was double image. Something akin to that. And that's what gives it that jumpy feeling, that very visceral, weird feeling where motion looks augmented in some way. And
is fitting for the, especially, obviously it's being used in in the storming of the beach in Normandy to great effect to put you in the middle of
Right.
everything is happening so fast
bullets
around
flying.
you, and everything is just, there's no time to stop and breathe and there's no slow motion in that storming scene, which, you know, anybody else would have these, like, you know, shots where you're embellishing, versus this is just like fucking go to this place, get this, like, it's
recently I
intense.
was just watching the opening sequence again, and I was comparing it against what was the Mel Gibson war movie with Andrew Garfield from a couple of years ago.
Oh, I know what you're not Tigerland. That's the
one where he's
Joel
the
Schumacher.
the medic who is
I
flags,
don't remember
or not flags, whatever. Anyways, I was just thinking about it and how, like, this is like they were like people blowing up and flying through the air in slow motion. I was just like, yeah, that's not, you know. And meanwhile, Saving Private Ryan, it was the shot where they follow one person up the beach, and it's just you're losing all, you know, understanding of what's happening around you.
Well, that, and I mean, the shots of the camera going underwater and the bullets going through the water during that part. On that,
here's
I mean,
the thing.
so
I will
many
say,
things.
of course, it's brilliant. The sound design is what makes that scene brilliant. Is how it's.
I don't know if you've ever
like,
watched
just,
the some of the, they don't do it. He didn't do a lot of behind the scenes. One of those things I always hated that Spielberg was not a fan of commentary is because there's so many movies I would love to hear him just sit and talk over. But they did talk about the sound design in Saving Private Ryan and how important it was, and the idea that half of it came from them shooting dead animals. Cows.
Yeah.
They were shooting cows to get. He's like, I needed the sound of what it sounds like when a bullet hits a body, and like they just and like all of those things are at play in a film like that. We could spend a whole episode on.
Of course, yeah. Anyways, I was just gonna say, so obviously that launched him into that next echelon of like, well, now he's Spielberg's guy. After if he wasn't after Schindler's List, he definitely is after Saving Private Ryan, and that's pretty much what he's done. But the work he has done is so, as we mentioned earlier, different in every single movie that he's done. And again, you brought up like Minority Report, a great looking movie, fantastic. Oh, I mean, talk about some great cinematography, completely desaturated, completely bleach bypass. You know, looks
all of
like
the light over. Yeah, I mean, there's so many shots of blinding light coming through that's almost just literally blinding the screen from.
Yeah,
from what you're looking
and
at.
then you have Catch Me If You Can, which has some wonderful dark moments. It's got some wonderful silhouette moments. It's got some very playful moments. Oversaturation of color, lots of different scenes to get the period really right, and then some great long takes of. Like I still think of the scene towards the end of the movie where Tom Hanks and Leonardo DiCaprio are speaking to one another, and he thinks that Leo is running because, you know, he's running, and they go over one of these, you know, it's basically shot on like a golf cart, and he's following behind them, and they're probably 30 yards apart, but they're having this scene together that's definitely 80 yards. So just so you know, they replaced the audio for this well later, but it keeps rack focusing back and forth between them as the entire scene is moving. It's one shot. It lasts about 2 minutes long, and they go over this like big thing, a hill, and inside of the airport as Tom Hanks and Leonardo DiCaprio are talking with one another. It's really clever shot design. I think that his shot design is really interesting.
I think it's this is going to sound like a terrible comparison. I apologize to use this person, but I go to this well often just because it makes sense to me. You talk about actors that are showy and actors that are good and actors that are showy, and they're both good. And somebody like we've talked about, it's Kevin Spacey. Kevin Spacey, despite just being a gross human being, great actor, but also like it draws attention. Like when Kevin Spacey is acting, you know his acting. I think Kamiński has a lot of the
acting.
Yeah. I think Kamiński, and it's not a negative. It's just that's the styles that Kamiński is like, fucking watch what I'm gonna do, and that's the Spielberg influence as well. Like there's the great shot in AI when they're at the fair, the robot fair thing that they go to, and it's the one take.
You don't think that Deakins is kind of let me show you what I can do, like a Blade Runner, especially like some of those
I think
shots where he's,
Deakins
like,
is more
through.
like
I don't know.
I'm gonna pull something off and kind of like, wait till you see what I pull off versus I don't know. It's a tough call.
If anything, I would say that Kamiński's the more naturalistic director, actually, in my opinion. I think that Deakins makes more paintings.
Okay.
And that Kamiński shoots more for this, what's going on in the scene, typically nowadays. Like if we're talking about them as whatever now. Let me lead this into what I think is his magnum opus, which is The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, I think, is the best cinematography of a film.
That was his fourth Oscar nod.
I think it's the best film cinematography of any film since the year 2000. And the reason why is because you're talking about an impossible story to tell that has to be told visually. We're talking about a story about somebody who has a stroke and loses the ability to speak. And they are experiencing everything from a hospital bed, and you were telling the story in the first person. That is going to be the most boring movie ever. Janusz Kamiński made that one of the more incredible experiences, cinematic experiences that I've ever had. I still remember, like, I was getting the shakes in that movie, just like understanding that he knows he's now even going through his like how he's going to learn how to communicate. And you hear an internal dialogue of him, of talking and like figuring out how he can align what he's seeing with what he's thinking. But just for an example, if you have not seen Diving Bell and the Butterfly, they shoot it in first person, like literally through an eyelash. Like his eyes are opening and closing. And it's also kind of interspersed with these really strange dream sequences and flashbacks. And it's just such an incredible visual movie. And I just can't imagine ever reading that book that he wrote and saying, I'm going to make a film out of this. And there's no way you could make a film out of this without Janusz Kamiński, because what he did with that film, I think is probably more improbable and incredible than anything I've ever seen on film.
When you look at the director is Julian Schnabel, which I really only knew from Basquiat, and has not actually done
a whole lot.
A ton of things. In fact, most of his things are art related.
He's a documentarian more than anything else. Yeah.
But yeah, it is very clear, and that's something I'm always very fascinated about as well. And it's where I like to see these guys working with other directors, and especially seeing which directors reach out to them to work on their films, because you look at somebody like Schnabel's not really a household name. This is probably the biggest. I mean, Diving Bell and the Butterfly might be his most. Basquiat and most well-known movie. And I'm sure a lot of people have not heard of it or seen it, even though it's for him it's well known. But it's interesting that something very clearly relies is sometimes you are looking for a lenser to execute your vision perfectly, right. And other times you're looking at your lenser to bring your vision, right? Exactly. And kind of and bring that side to it. And I think that's really fascinating. And you look, at Kamiński and Deakins are really interesting. So Deakins worked with Tim Robbins after he worked on, he does it's called Shawshank Redemption, which stars Tim Robbins. Then Tim Robbins directs a movie called Dead Man Walking, and he brings Deakins to that. The same as Angelina Jolie, she brought him for Unbroken, which was her first directing. Yeah. Like, I like seeing these actors that recognize kind of like, especially an actor doing it, because the actor knows I'm not a director. I've seen a lot of directors. I want to make my foray, but I am going to need to be able to rely on someone who is going to not just light this, but tell this story with me and make this work. And yeah, you reach out to two people like this. You reach out to Kamiński, especially because like Spielberg is shooting movie after movie after movie. He takes a break every like 7 years for a year and a half, and then he's shooting fucking movie. So like if I can get one of those break periods, this guy is going to do amazing shit for me, and I'm very interested in hiring that out.
Yeah,
I think that's, and I mean, that's like, you know, Funny People is a polarizing movie from the Apatow. It's his attempt at James L. Brooks, which I'm a big James L. Brooks fan. So, it's funny. So
because
Kamiński does Funny People, and the year later he does How Do You Know, which is a James L. Brooks film, which is not James L. Brooks's best or even close to.
I've never seen it, so
I've seen it. It's
a movie.
It's a frustrating movie because everyone in it is someone I want to see succeed in that movie, and it's just kind of, it's just a movie. But it is interesting to watch kind of these people jump around, and that will always endear me to a filmmaker, to somebody like Apatow, to recognize like, hey, I'm trying something different here. I don't want this to look like Knocked Up and 40-Year-Old Virgin. I need to set myself apart. I need to get somebody in here to help me visually separate this from what I've done before.
And the irony is, it doesn't look. I mean,
it doesn't.
That shows you that he's trying to serve the director's vision, because it doesn't look that different than his other movies.
You're correct, like, and that's a little bit of a letdown.
Which probably means he brought him in, and they had multiple meetings. He said, "Look, if you want it to feel this way, this is the way you should shoot it. It's the way you've been shooting all your movies."
And you know, and in fairness to it, because I have not watched it in years, especially knowing that somebody like Kamiński's working on it, I might find something more if I watch it today, and how it's framed, and how the characters are being placed next to one another. I think it's definitely not in the lighting or the aesthetic, but it might be there somewhere in the performances.
No, you might find something, but again, just to kind of close things out, I mean, like, cinematographers are there to serve the director's aesthetic. So understanding, I mean, one of the interesting things, because I think that Judd Apatow is only kind of half of a director, which is kind of and I don't mean as discredit to him, because it actually works for him. It works. It makes him better than a lot of, I feel like, established directors, and that he doesn't really understand the movie making side of things. He understands character working. He understands working with actors, and that's the most important.
Like
part
Kevin
of being
Smith,
a director. Yeah, exactly, like Kevin Smith. Very much like Kevin Smith, actually.
They're play directors.
A lot of comedy people. Yes, exactly. They want certain things, and they want. Only Kevin Smith will say it like this, and Judd Apatow
he will line read them.
yeah. And Judd Apatow's like, make me laugh. That's the big difference between him and Kevin Smith. But I think it's interesting because there's a huge difference between being given a property like that and having, obviously, you have big money behind a movie like Funny People. So Kamiński's going to take that job. If he's got the time and he's got the energy or whatever, he's going to take the job. And then you meet and you read the script and you start storyboarding, and you're like, okay, this is going to look exactly the same as all your other movies, because that's what serves the movie best.
Mm-hmm.
That's what a cinematographer's job is. It's like, what is going to serve this film the best? I think one of the reasons why Deakins is so well regarded now is because he works with acutely visual directors. Like, I mean, the Coens are already kind of built in because he's grown up with them.
Yeah.
And now if you look at the camera work in a movie like Hudsucker Proxy versus the camera work in a Coen Brothers movie now, it's night and day. And the reason why is because Deakins has kind of grown up with them, and they know each other well enough that they know that he has what he has handled, and it's going to serve the story. He's not just trying to put it camera A, camera B, get here, cover this, get this, move on. I'm going to do the best I can. He has carte blanche to do what he wants to with Coen Brothers movies now. Same as Janusz Kamiński with Spielberg. I think that Spielberg doesn't have to look through the lens the way he used to.
And he doesn't want to, he wants shorthand. He wants to get these things done. Like he's a machine. He wants it done and out there.
He wants to move on to the next thing. I forgot the first point I was going to make with that, though.
Well, it is kind of also interesting to look at the types of films that each of them, Kamiński, because it's Spielberg, are very large, like we said, they're large movies. There's a lot of special effects work that's going into that, versus you don't see as much of that on Deakins' side. And Deakins is doing a lot. I mean, you do Blade Runner and Skyfall are big ones. But what's kind of interesting is, I mean, I don't know if did he lens Dune?
He do Dune?
I didn't see it. I doesn't mean he did. I actually do need to look that up, because I don't remember seeing that, which would be kind of crazy if he didn't do it. But it's also pandemic, so God only knows. Now, I will say, you look kind of the idea of Coen brothers are very dialogue heavy, even though they are visual films, but a lot of it is dialogue. Versus 1917, which is also Deakins, is one of the few movies that is very not necessarily dialogue driven, because it's kind of just this real
very
thing.
Visual driven.
It's very much a visual, which is interesting to see him stretch in that. And I think you can kind of look at those that way. What I did find funny, kind of looking at the CGI versus not CGI kind of movies overall on these, and Kamiński being a little heavier on that, is the last released movie that Kamiński lensed, and I have not seen it, but I do want to just share this anecdote because it is kind of amazing, is The Call of the Wild with God. Harrison Ford. Now, Call of the Wild is based on a Jack London book, and it's about sledding dogs. And this movie was shot with no real sled dogs. They are all CGI. And I've watched behind the scenes, and they have put grown men in motion capture suits.
A grown man.
And made him walk around like a dog with Harrison Ford for Harrison Ford to interact with, and then they've overlaid the effects on it. And if I could have just been a fly on the wall on just one day of this, and also like watching Kamiński light this man dog, and Harrison Ford just being like, goddamn fucking what I was fucking Han Solo. Like, what is that? Like, no. That is a movie that one day I'm going to sit down and watch all of the behind the scenes footage on it.
I just want to see Harrison and the dog actor get into a fight at one point. He's like, you were late on your cue.
Get off my rug. And then this guy's just pissing on his leg. That's a weird way to sort of tie up this podcast, but I just thought that was really funny that pre-pandemic Kamiński has to go back, and now Kamiński is shooting. They finished shooting West Side Story, which I'm very curious to see I'm very curious to see how that movie is shot and what it's going to look like. I know that's a passion project from Spielberg. Most people are not. Everyone was kind of like, why the fuck is he like? A lot of people just don't care, and I love that Spielberg is just like, fuck it, I don't care if you care. I want to do this.
Yeah, it's fine. I mean, like Robert Wise did the first one, and I don't think he can be beat. So I
like that even somebody of Spielberg's stature can just be like, this is a movie I was raised on, and all I've ever wanted to do my entire life was do
a version
of it that's probably going to look just like the one that I grew up on and loved, but I just get to fucking do a chance with it. I'm curious to see how that one comes out.
Well, so anyways, to close, they're both Deakins and Kamiński, Janusz Kamiński, are very, very, very accomplished cinematographers, if not the most accomplished cinematographers. And again, it's never with people, especially of that stature. It's never this person's better than that person or whatever. That's the type of arguments that plebes would have online about like, oh, Deakins shits on Kamiński's bed or whatever, you know. It has nothing to do with
word to our listeners, he has not ever shat on his bed, just so we know we don't get a cease and
we don't know that, actually. Maybe he has.
And it was lit. It was lit beautifully.
We're gonna get a personal message. Be like, actually, I did. I shat on his bed after I lost the Oscar. I took a shit on his bed. Yeah, but now that's anyways, again, it's more about what we see with cinematographers and really successful cinematographers when they successfully match their aesthetic with the director's aesthetic, and they're able to bring something artistic more than what would have been done with any other cinematographer. And that's what I was going to say is about the whole Schnabel and Kamiński thing, is that I'm not sure that Deakins would have been able to do Diving Bell and the Butterfly. But then again, I don't think that Janusz Kamiński would have been able to do Blade Runner or do Arrival. So in the way that it was done. So there's nobody wins here. It's just
it's the
fun
the
thing
same
to
as
discuss against.
Yeah, I mean there is I like our listicles, but I never like putting anything in order as far as like
we're just trying to get more downloads. We're gonna say it's like Janusz Kamiński versus
fuck Kamiński and his shitting on people's beds. He's a real dirtbag. It's me too, buddy.
Kamiński versus Deakins. Battle of the Titans. See who goes down first. Actually, I'm about to see who goes down first right now because I'm gonna watch Godzilla.
I heard Kong goes down on Godzilla for like an alarming period, and it's hot, super fucking hot. It's all I don't know much about that movie, but
the best part was you paused there because the internet cut out for a second, so you go, "It's super fucking hot."
Kong goes down on Godzilla Part 2. That'll be our next podcast. So we will be coming back with reviews on that and some other flicks and lots of good stuff coming up for y'all. So thank you so much for listening. I know this is one of our more geekier, in-depth podcasts. I enjoy these because I don't know a ton about cinematography, and I like to learn more about it. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it and learned a little bit about it. And we'll talk to you next episode.
That's interesting. Drink. Cheers.
Oh, fuck. Cheers.
Drink twice.
All right, bye.